Recording in progress.
One quick jury out before.
That's fine. We can do that. Yes, I'm going to address that. Let me first cover with you one issue, and that is, after some consideration about these two questions the jurors asked, and I don't know if this is part of what you're dealing with, but the two questions were, again, let's bring the defendant out first, and then I'll address this. All right, the two questions were, why were the photos from the Robertson County Jail, and then the question was more offensive question. I think out of an abundance of caution, it just seems like that's interjecting, the more offenses is being interjected into that could create an issue, and I'm going to ask the first question but not ask the second question. The reason I'm doing that is if he knows the answer to the first question, we'll allow him to answer it. If he doesn't, then he doesn't. So we'll go from there.
Judge, on that issue, I've spoken with General Prowse, and we have agreed to a stipulation on that issue.
On which issue?
What you just addressed, to enter a stipulation, announcing to the jury that Mr. Wiggins is being held in the Robertson County Jail on this case, and that he has not picked up any additional charges.
All right, so that the stipulation can be clear, the parties are going to stipulate that the defendant is being held, and Mr. Wiggins is being held, and was being held in the Robertson County Jail and that's just it, by agreement that he was being held for this case in the Robertson County Jail, and that it did not involve new offenses.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. All right. Then we'll bring
Actually,
that-
we have
hold on.
two items
We have hold on.
we'd like to take up while the jury's out, so we don't stop at some point during the
We're going to be
cross-examination.
having our dinner break at 6, so.
This won't take long. So the first issue, Your Honor, deals with, excuse me, a cross-examination point dealing with communication with the defendant's son, Spencer, and it also ties into DCS records that were that were touched on in Mr. Cottle's direct examination. One is I would be asking questions regarding what happened with between Mr. Wiggins and Ms. Creaseman that led him to go into state's custody, which revolves around a domestic assault when she was pregnant. And then as it ties with that, as well as into speaking with the son Spencer, there's an audio of a jail call from Dickson County Jail that we would ask the court to hear, and Mr. Etheridge has it queued up to play.
All right, so the first is a communication or records regarding from the Department of Children's Services.
Yes, Your Honor.
And explain to me again what they supposedly show.
Well, Your Honor, and I've got the record with me. I pulled up the exact slide that I'm speaking about. On slide, what I have is 74. There is something I highlighted in particular. It talks about Mr. Wiggins having behavioral issues. One second, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
Yes.
And if I wasn't clear, Your Honor, I'm referring to the exhibit that the defense entered.
All right. May I see that exhibit, please? The last exhibit, which would be the
No, the PowerPoint
PowerPoint
slides.
presentation,
Yeah.
264.
That's what I have is 74. Yeah.
And which of these are you referring to specifically?
It says Life with Aunt Julie and Uncle Jimmy Creaseman.
Life with Aunt Julie and Uncle Jimmy Creaseman. All right. And so what, I have it before me.
Your Honor, ultimately the point is it talks about began having behavioral issues, and a DCS referral was made to and a case manager assigned. And in particular, in that particular set of DCS records, I was going to introduce two different documents, one from December 9th of 2004 that deals with, I have something to highlight, in particular a line highlighted. The basic rules for Stephen was that he should go to school, take a shower daily, keep his room clean, and be respectful of the family. Stephen failed on every rule. He was disrespectful, truant, and would not keep himself or his room clean. For two reasons. One, the behavioral issues that are discussed in this slide, as well as when there's a slide regarding Mr. Wiggins being picked on, and that kind of gives some more context to that whole story. Then there's a second document from November 22nd of 2004. It's documented by DCS that on November 17th of 2004, Stephen apparently, I'm reading directly from it, Stephen apparently stepped over the line too far, and there was a domestic assault charge filed against him by his Aunt Julie Creaseman. And in that, there's also a line about Stephen placed somewhere other than his home, especially due to his wife being pregnant and the stress it's causing her. And ultimately, the point I'm getting at is this phone call. It's actually number 2, Mr. Etheridge, in the line that you have up there. If you would play that second phone call.
For English, for a collect call, please enter your PIN number now. Please enter the area code and phone number you are calling now. Please hold. Please wait while your call is being connected. Please hold. Hello, this is a prepaid call from an inmate at the Davidson County Sheriff's Office. To accept this call, press 0. To refuse this call, hang up or press 1. Your current balance is $25.93. This call is from a corrections facility and is subject to monitoring and recording. Thank you for using Global Telling. Hey, my drink is spewing everywhere. Yeah, my drink just spewed.
Mr. Etheridge, if you would advance to where this call is on the, I guess the time of the call. That's sufficient.
I was pregnant.
Oh, we'll kick her in the stomach.
You should back up, please. Back to, that's fine right there.
I know, but Daddy's been in lots of trouble. Daddy just moved far, far away. You know that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so now I'm far, far away. Daddy's gonna be gone a long time.
Hey, Dad. Dad. I'm going to start school next week.
I know, you're getting to be such a big boy, you're gonna be in 2nd grade, ain't you?
Hey, guess what?
What?
Mama is pregnant.
Do what?
Mama's pregnant.
Oh, we'll kick her in the stomach.
That's it. Thank you. And that's the remark we're getting at, Your Honor.
Well,
That Mr. Wiggins' son says Mama's pregnant. Mr. Wiggins states that basically say what? Spencer repeats himself, saying that Mama's pregnant, and he says, "Well, kick her in the stomach then." And so, Your Honor, this whole witness has dealt with humanizing, if you will, as they're allowed, Mr. Wiggins, but there's still things that the jury needs to hear. In particular, things that they've hit on, events that they've hit on in Mr. Wiggins' past that, when you take into context like what he said here, are extremely relevant, and the jury needs to hear that.
Judge, in response, I'll take it as he brought them up. The issue about the DCS records initially about he was defiant and wouldn't keep his room clean, I think that was talked about as part of the testimony. I don't think there's any issue with that.
excuse me, Mr. Evans, do you have a copy of the DCS records you're wanting, or are you just going to have it on the screen?
I have a copy of it, Your Honor.
Can I see it?
Sure. There's another one, too.
All right, the basic rules for Stephen. This is a copy of a recording. Is there more than one? So you wanting to introduce both of these?
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor, my original understanding was that he was wanting to cross-examine him with that fact that was highlighted in that first DCS document. The statement, the basic rules for Stephen was that he should go to school, take a shower daily, keep his room clean, and be respectful to the family. Stephen failed on every rule. He was disrespectful, truant, and would not keep himself or his room clean. As to that statement, I don't have any issue. If he wants to ask that question, as whether or not the record says that. As far as putting this entire page of the record in, this goes into detail. It says there's a host of other problems from assault, theft, drug use. He had enough and did not believe that Stephen would change. They were doubtful that Stephen would even try to change or be better. And so it goes into more detail about things that I do think would be inappropriate, and prejudicial.
Well, number one, this witness can't introduce DCS records per se. In my opinion, the only thing that could be done on cross-examination properly would be he has been testifying about the background and introduced the slideshow about the life with Aunt Julie and Uncle Jimmy Creaseman. And since he is giving a social history as a witness, then he can, in my opinion, be cross-examined about his knowledge regarding these issues. And I think the proper way of handling it would be not to just have him introduce these records, but rather ask him if he is aware of those of that fact, that, that being a part of the occurrence. And in other words, if he has presented, and he has this evidence about life with Aunt Julie and Uncle Jimmy Creaseman and counseling sessions and everything else that he's introduced, cross-examination about the extent of his investigation, how in-depth it was, and I think that is an appropriate way of handling it. But and I think that he can be asked about whether as a part of his investigation he examined these records and was aware of those allegations in those records, and whether he investigated it further or if he chose to let that not be a part of his investigation. But I don't think, and I think they can be demonstrated to him to ask whether or not he did or did not examine those records and whether he was aware of them. But as far as just being able to introduce the records, I don't think that is the appropriate, that he is the appropriate witness. On rebuttal, the state can always introduce someone from DCS as the record keeper if they choose to do so. But are you following what I'm trying to say.
I'm with you, Your Honor.
That it does seem to me that it's relevant, and to the extent that his investigation was in-depth and a correct investigation, I think he's subject to cross-examination on that point, and this information can be used on cross-examination. The introduction of the record itself would not be appropriate through this witness, in my opinion. And since my opinion right now is the one that counts, that's what we'll go with. So, all right. Then is there another issue?
Yeah. Yes, Your Honor, there's actually two. There's two documents that I handed up. One was a one-page. The other one dealt with,
The phone call about the kicking, telling him to kick him in the stomach.
ultimately, that's another one I was going to get at, yes. I guess we can address that one first.
Well, my thought, I think both of these pages that you have provided with Department of Children's Services records, both of those are documents that, in my opinion, as I've indicated, the way I think they should be handled, and that this witness is subject to cross-examination. In regards to the telephone call from the jail, it presents a lot of other problems, one of them being the fact that on the beginning of that, it identifies that it's a collect call from the Davidson County Jail and Correctional Facility. Why is it necessary to introduce that, other than obviously you might want the jury to know that, but other than...
Honestly, it's not, Your Honor.
All right.
I wasn't sure how quickly they got into the conversation.
Then what about, and the part of that you want to introduce is his conversations with his son, where and I'm just stating what I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding. You're stating that you want this introduced to show this witness a different side of the relationship between Mr. Wiggins and his son?
Yes.
And that being that he would tell his son something like that?
Yes.
All right. Let me hear from Mr. Evans.
If we're just talking about the portion that was played,
Just that second portion that was...
We're not going to have the introduction of the jail, of the intro call where the jail is identified as collect call from a facility.
So it starts with...
Why don't we do this? Why don't, to ensure that we stay away from those kinds of areas, why don't you just simply ask this witness if he's aware of the fact that this call was made, that this call was placed by Mr. Wiggins to his son, and set the stage and ask him that question if he's aware of that, and then if he is or is not, then you can play the recorded part just where the statement you're seeking to, that's the only relevant part, comes in. I think that's the appropriate way of handling it.
Your Honor, just to be clear, something that I noticed as I was looking at this, I will ask Mr. Etheridge to rename the file names so that they're not prejudicial. They just need to be those, specifically anything past stomach, the word stomach needs to be taken out.
Examine this witness about, this is Mr. Cattle, C-A-D-E-L-L.
No, sir. It's C-A-U-D-E-L.
Okay.
Caldell.
Caldell. And the first name was Mark, correct?
Yes, sir.
In any event, the state's going to be allowed to cross-examine Mr. Caldell about the documents from the Department of Children's Services. Now, assuming that we eliminate the first part of that phone call where it is identifying that it's being made collect from a penal
For English,
institution.
for a collect call,
That part, that's exactly what I'm talking about. So assuming we eliminate that part and we just have a conversation with his son, Mr. Evans, is there any other basis that you have for an objection?
The only other thing is whether or not Mr. Caldell, if he's not familiar with he's never heard the recording, I don't know that he can be impeached with it. Absent that, no, Your Honor, based on the ruling and what they intend to play with the intro out, I don't have an issue with it.
Well, I think he's entitled to be asked about whether or not he's familiar with it.
Agreed.
All right. Well, when the jury returns, then the first thing I'm going to deal with is the question about why were the photos from the Robertson County Jail. Have we clarified the two issues then that you had concerns about?
Yes.
We're ready for the jury to return.
There was one final one in that regards. I was going to ask Mr. Caudle about if he has ever seen the defendant's tattoos. And I've got some pictures for Mr. Evans to look at. What I'm talking about. I'll pass a copy to Your Honor.
Well, let me first address the way that I think that the phone call should be handled is that you're going to be asking this on cross-examination. I think you can ask this witness about the extent of his investigation, the social history he has presented, and you can ask him whether or not he's aware of that, of those records from the Department of Children's Services, and whether he considered those or included them, or if he didn't, why he didn't. And number two would be the issue of the phone call. You can ask him about whether he's aware of the phone call, and if he's aware of what was said during the phone call. And if he answers that he's not, then I don't even have a problem with you necessarily at giving the details of the phone call rather than play the phone call. The reason that I'm suggesting that is that it's really done to show, I'm assuming, the extent of his investigation, whether it included all material that might be relevant. And the phone call itself, if he acknowledges he's heard it or if he acknowledges he doesn't, I'm not sure the phone call is necessary to be played, but we'll reserve that issue. Second thing is that these photos, and the same thing with the photographs, if he's aware of them, you know, then did he consider them in any fashion in his history? That would seem to me to be the proper way to cross-examine this witness. Going beyond that to introduce those photographs through this witness may not necessarily be the appropriate way of handling it, but we'll see what he says when you ask those questions. So.
Very good.
All right. Then we will bring the jury back and we'll deal with these matters in that fashion.
Maybe we should just go through the questioning right now.
Probably a good idea.
That's fine.
Before we bring them back, let's go ahead and do that. So. You're going to get a trial run, Mr. White. Go ahead and ask.
Thank you. Mr. Caudle, throughout the course of your investigation, did you said you had a thorough investigation, is that correct?
I don't recall saying that.
If
Was
you
it a
can pull
complete
that
investigation?
microphone, either scoot up or pull the
I'm sorry.
microphone towards you, please.
Would you consider a thorough investigation?
I did a investigation. I did try to do a thorough investigation.
And you tried to do a complete investigation?
Well, I mean, doing a social history on someone for 35 years, I mean, I don't know that it could ever really be complete.
And throughout your investigation, you had obviously looked at documents or spoken to people who were familiar with Mr. Wiggins living with Julie and Jimmy Creaseman, correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
During your investigation, you either spoke to or reviewed documents pertaining the defendant living with Julie and Jimmy or James Creaseman, correct?
Yes, I did.
Hal, Officer Hal, pull that microphone closer to the
I'm
witness,
sorry.
please.
And through that, did you review DCS records pertaining to the defendant staying with the Creasemans?
Yes, I did review some DCS records from when he was staying at Julie Creaseman's.
And so through that investigation and reviewing those records, you're aware then that one of the reasons the defendant was taken out of the placement with the Creasemans is because Mr. Wiggins, the defendant, had apparently stepped over the line and there was a domestic assault charge filed against him by his aunt, Miss Creaseman, who was in fact pregnant at the time.
Yes, I recall that there was a domestic assault charge. I don't know the disposition of it.
And then you had a slide in here that discussed the defendant being picked on for kind of being unkempt, dirty, so on and so forth. You're aware of a document where that was his hygiene was a basic rule in the Creaseman household, correct?
Yes, those were two separate periods of time. I mean, the classmates that I referred to that described him like that were much younger in his life. That was before he had come to live with Julie Creaseman.
And so, but you reviewed those documents, correct?
The DCS records?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
And then, are you aware of a phone call between that Mr. Wiggins placed with his son Spencer regarding Spencer starting second grade?
No.
Are you aware that during that phone call that Mr. Wiggins made a statement in response to Spencer saying that mommy was pregnant, that the defendant said, kick her in the stomach?
I do not recall that.
Were you provided copies of the phone call records given to the defense as part of discovering this case?
I don't recall if I have jail calls, phone calls. I was mostly reviewing documents.
Okay. Did you ever meet with Mr. Wiggins yourself?
One time.
When you happen to know the date that was?
I do not. It's been about 3 months ago.
Okay. When you met with him, were you aware that he had a death row tattoo on his right flank?
And let me back up. When you said meet with him, do you mean in person?
Yes, that's what I asked.
Okay, I'm sorry. I met with him one time, but I don't recall looking at any tattoos, and if it was on his back, he would have been wearing a shirt.
So then on his back, you're not aware that he has a tattoo that says "No Mercy"?
No, I don't know what his I know he has tattoos, but I don't know what they are.
Very good. Thank you.
It would seem to me, Mr. White, that if you ask him the question that was he aware of the phone call, and then he answers no, that I don't think you can then go into what was in the phone call that he's unaware of. The same thing would be with the tattoos. If he's not aware of them, I assume you have other means of trying to introduce them if they become relevant, if you assert that they are. So it was. I believe that the proper way of doing it is, as I've explained, you've gone into the DCS records and you can ask the questions about whether he's aware of these other issues, but once he answers no, then I don't think you can ask the follow-up question about where you specify what's in the phone call or you specify the other thing. That would be my ruling.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else?
Just for future purposes, and so we can be on the record, we do think they're relevant. We understand your ruling is we can't put them on through this witness, but this witness has provided a 92-page social history, and our position is that he incorporated everything that was advantageous for the defendant, but things that are not, he left out. So we do intend to introduce those to rebuttal witnesses, but we are clear on your order.
I understand that completely, and I'm assuming that will be the case, and you're certainly free to ask him the questions that you just made the statement about, whether or not he included only favorable items and left out unfavorable items when he's asked about the tattoos, when he's asked about this phone call and so forth. That's a legitimate inquiry. But once he answers no, then your point, it would seem to me, is made, and I don't think it's appropriate then in your follow-up question to provide information in that manner. I think you can do it through other witnesses, and certainly are not foregoing. What I'm making is that once he answers no, I don't think you can go beyond that. You can do it later.
Thank you.
All right. Are we ready for the jury then?
Yes, Your Honor.
Bring the jury in. What, do you want these photographs back of the tattoo for now, or you want me to just hold them up? They're not been made an exhibit. We'll,
Correct. While the jury's coming in, if you don't mind, let's keep them there, just in case.
all right, we have all of our jurors back. Ladies and gentlemen, there was a question that was submitted to me, actually two questions, and for the record, those questions, well, the first one was, why were the photos from the Robertson County Jail? Second question was more offenses, question mark. I want to read to you that the parties have stipulated that Mr. Wiggins is being held in the Robertson County Jail for these offenses, and there are no other charges there that he's being held for. All right? So that answers that question. Now, Mr. Wyatt, you have cross-examination for this witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. All right, Mr. Cottle, so earlier when you first started out, you said that you were a mitigation specialist, correct?
Investigator.
Investigator, okay. One of the terms that Mr. Evans used was a social historian. Is that correct?
I mean, I do social history, yes,
Okay.
yes, in this case.
What sort of specific training do you have to do that job?
I have attended a great number of training sessions, NACTL, other mitigation seminars. I've been working, I started off with the Shelby County Public Defender's Office and as an investigator, and then moved to the Capitol team. And then from the State Public Defender's Office, I then went to work for the Federal Public Defender's Office, both for the Western District of Pennsylvania and the Eastern District of California, Federal Public Defender in the Capitol Habeas Unit. And I have a master's degree in criminal justice, focusing primarily on criminology and behavioral analysis.
Thank you. Also, when you started out, you said that you were a fact investigator, right?
In some cases, in this case, I'm working as a mitigation investigator, and in other types of cases, I work as a fact investigator, and they're separate.
But are you not looking for facts?
Depends on the role that I'm filling on the defense team. In this case, I'm working as a mitigation investigator.
Surely you're not saying, though, you don't look for facts in your job, right?
My job is to look at the background of the defendant, and in this case, and kind of outline the growth and development of the person, and show how they were raised. And we do that through obtaining records when possible to verify any claims made by people. And then we try to talk to lots of different family members to get different people's points of view.
You brought it up, so let's talk about the sources of your information. Clearly, you've talked to different individuals in this, correct?
Yes.
Could you name the individuals you've spoken with?
All of them?
Yes.
No, I could not name them all.
Okay. What documents have you looked at?
We have thousands of documents, medical records, mental health records, DCS records, educational records, finance records, birth records, other family members' hospital records.
And so, in your opinion of your work, have you done an investigation?
I have done an okay investigation. I've tried to do a good investigation. Again, like I was alluded to earlier, we've got 35 years of his life that we're trying to condense in a very short time frame. And so if we were to do a complete social history on him, we would be here for days.
And so naturally you've had to leave things out, correct?
That's correct.
Now, when you first walked up here, you gave an oath to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing but the truth, but also the whole truth, correct?
Yes.
But as I was just talking about, I'm not saying you didn't tell the truth, but you didn't tell the whole truth of all the facts about Mr. Wiggins' life, correct?
I'm not here. I was not asked to come and tell all facts of Mr. Wiggins' life.
And so what were you asked to do?
To develop a social history of Mr. Wiggins, going back to look at influences that could have had an effect on his growth and development.
And so you were asked to provide the good, the bad, and the ugly, weren't you?
I was asked to look at factors that could have affected his growth and development, and then to present it to the court today.
I don't think you quite answered my question. You were asked to find facts,
No.
whether they're good, whether they're bad, or whether they were ugly about Mr. Wiggins' life.
I'm not a fact investigator in this position. My job is to interview witnesses and get their perception of the events that helped shape Mr. Wiggins' life from an early childhood.
And so, as you said earlier, you spoke to a lot of people, correct?
That is correct.
And the information that you presented in your PowerPoint was everything they said, or at least to the extent of what you provided in your PowerPoint?
It's my observations of what I saw and my take on people's information that they provided, and observations that I saw at homes, living conditions, my interpretation of records, not necessarily interpretation, but I would take the records and then take snippets of those records to provide a background of Mr. Wiggins' life.
And so, it's no secret you were hired by the defense team in order to portray or humanize the defendant as best you could.
That's correct.
Excuse me. During your direct, I made a note that you spoke with, the word you used was significant people. Do you recall saying that in Mr. Wiggins' life?
I do not.
And along those lines, you said that you took links to verify statements of what they said, correct?
We look for records that could potentially verify people's statements.
And so, as we go through this, I'll ask a couple times if you were able to find records to verify some of the things that are said. But we'll go through your PowerPoint to try to make it clear, okay? All right, so I'm going to skip ahead to, let's start with what I have is slide 3. And in that, it shows the defendant's father and mother and his older brother, Scott, and then the defendant's date of births. Or in the case of the father, when he passed away, correct?
Okay.
And in that, it says Scotty, as you referred to him, was born in 1982, correct?
I believe so.
And there's no date of death, correct?
That is correct.
Are you aware that the defendant told one of the mental health experts that his brother was dead?
I believe I remember reading something about that in something.
Madam Clerk, if I could see exhibit, let's see, 257, please. Sir, have you reviewed the record from Middle Tennessee Mental Health Institute pertaining to the defendant?
Can you be a little more specific?
I'll pass it up and see if you can
Okay.
recognize it. Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Have you previously reviewed that document before today?
Yes, I have.
If you would look at the initial evaluation, there's a history of present illness.
Yes.
And it appears to be, if you would read the perhaps the 6th sentence that starts with subsequently patient reports.
Yes.
If you would read that sentence, please.
Subsequently, patient reports that his brother died 2 days before I shot the cop.
And the next sentence.
The patient reports that the death of his brother significantly exacerbated his depressed mood and thoughts of suicide.
Thank you very much. If you will hand that back to the clerk, please. skip through your. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but I will ask this. Earlier on, you spoke about instances of child abuse, so to speak, that occurred in the family history, correct?
Yes.
How were you able to verify the statements that were given to you that surround that?
Well, it depends on who you're talking about being abused, but when you said the family history, I mean, we have the brother, Scotty, who provided information. Stephen's mother, Juanita, multiple friends of the family who had witnessed the abuse, both firsthand and the aftermath of the abuse, the bruises.
Okay.
Quite a few family members who witnessed the abuse. One cousin who saw Scott beat Scotty with his belt over and over again at Christmas time.
Okay. I guess what I'm getting at is, was there any documentation you relied upon, or was it just the stories that were told?
Was there any documentation that I reviewed regarding Stephen's physical abuse, or?
And I'm talking back in his family history, way back.
No, I don't know that there's any documents from like his grandfather. None that I know of.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
All right. Now, on what I have as slide 25, deals with Catherine Wiggins' mental health history.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a snippet out of the Ridgeview intake from Ridgeview Behavioral Health Services, is that correct?
Correct.
Are you aware that in that, or did you review that document?
Yes, I believe I did.
Mr. Cottle, in particular, turn your attention to page 14.
Okay.
And where it says R/O F 19-99, if you would read that statement, please.
Unspecified other or unknown substance-related disorder due to constant requests for Klonopin, continuing to request the medication when she was told it would not be prescribed, comments that Klonopin was the only medication which would help her, reports of being discharged from pain clinic due to not taking her medications appropriately.
Now, I want to be perfectly clear, Mr. Cottle. We're not insinuating that there was not a mental health issue, but based on what you've read, would you agree it appears that she's there, doctor, based on that note?
Objection. Speaks for itself, Judge, his opinion, or asking
You have to speak up.
asking him to speculate as to why that person may or may not have been there is not relevant. Records speak for themselves. You can't decipher them.
It would appear you're asking this witness to make a speculation or to guess about something, Mr. White. Do you have a different interpretation?
I do, Your Honor. That's what he's done throughout this. He testified that he takes this information from others, and he used the word interpretation and corrected himself, but that's the basis.
I believe that was his testimony. Overruled the objection.
I'll take that back, sir. Thank you. Excuse me. What I have is slide 32. It's Scott Wiggins, adolescent years. That's the title of it. And to be clear, you are referring to the defendant's father, correct?
Yes.
Before I ask that, did you review the body camera footage from this crime?
Yes, I have.
There are certain words that people with, I guess, the new Scott Wiggins used to describe him, and they're in your slide, correct?
Yes.
And one of them is manipulative,
Yes.
one of them is violent,
Correct.
one is calculating,
Yes.
cruel,
Yes.
and had no empathy.
Correct.
Would you characterize, based on your investigation, what you saw in the video as manipulative, violent, calculating, cruel, and without empathy?
Objection.
Legal basis?
It's not, his opinion of the video is not relevant.
Sustained, it would be his. Ladies and gentlemen, you are the triers of fact in this case, and you will determine for yourself how you view that and what you think the facts are. The question that's being asked is of this witness to characterize it in his opinion, and I have sustained the objection. It's your opinion that matters and your finding.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I believe Mr. Evans talked about this, but moving forward to the slide 39, the 1402 Margrave, I think I'm saying that correctly, in Harriman, that address. Did you take those photographs?
Yes, I did.
And so, just to be clear, you're not trying to insinuate that the condition that those photographs, the house that that's in, is what it was when Mr. Wiggins lived there, correct?
Not whatsoever. None whatsoever.
Thank you.
Although the exterior of the house is pretty much the same.
Thank you. Now, on slide number 47, this is the slide that pertains to this photograph purporting to be the defendant as a young child, and it discusses him being hit by his father's elbow. Do you know the date of that photograph?
I do not.
And so, who was the source of that photograph?
His mother.
And was she able to provide you documentation to corroborate that what we see in the picture is what you're purporting it to be in this PowerPoint presentation?
Besides the photo itself?
Ultimately, how do we know that what we see there is something like a black eye as opposed to like shoe polish or something?
He was taken to the doctor for it.
I understand. I'm talking about the photograph. We're not disputing that these things happen, but the photograph, how do we know that that photograph was taken soon after the defendant was hit by his father's elbow?
It was just reported from Juanita that a friend of Juanita's took that photograph and then gave it to her. And then she took Stephen to the doctor, and that was the doctor's visit from when he got hit in the eye.
All right. On slide 48, and this refers to the defendant at age 13, and in it deals with, there's a part of a document that deals with his surgery for his testicle, correct?
Correct.
And you wrote on there, it says, Stephen, due to trauma to scrotal area, lost testicle at age 13, correct?
Correct.
And it says reason for consultation, and this is in your slide, epidemio-orchitis, correct?
Okay.
You put the record in here, is that what it says?
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, so I believe sounds accurate.
We are aware that that's actually a bacterial or viral infection and is not caused by trauma?
There are other records that I reviewed that from that incident where the patient had complained of, I believe, 4 or 5 previous histories of trauma to the growing area. I indicated the record on that slide to show that the surgery took place.
Okay.
There were other records that talked about trauma where he had, I believe, in one of the instances, he had slipped on an embankment while carrying fishing equipment.
On slide 50, it shows an intake evaluation for Ridgeview Psychiatric Hospital and Center it's dated September 27th of 1996.
Okay?
Are you familiar with that slide?
Yes.
And you cut a snippet out and highlighted an area that says, client's mom reports, quote, he seems to get, quote, paranoid and loses his temper, end quote. Were you aware, or did you notice that right below that in the actual document, the diagnosis is actually ADHD and depression?
That was Dr. Foote's diagnosis, I recall.
Do you not think that that's important to also see in there?
Again, I can't include everything. My job was to look at a lot of the factors that talked about his early mental health, and we put parts in there to show that the mental health problems that he started having came from an early age. I mean, it wasn't to show the diagnosis, it was to show he started having these types of symptoms at an early age.
And so back to one of my previous questions, we didn't show the whole truth on that document, did we?
We can't show the whole document in a PowerPoint.
You did basically on slide 48 with that medical record, correct?
I don't believe so. The whole document? I think it was 30 pages or more.
The whole page of the document.
Right. I mean, there were parts of it that were just more important than others on that document to show that there was the name at the top, and that's why I showed the whole page showing the surgery, was so that you could see the doctor's name and the patient's name, and then a little bit of the write-up as to what happened.
And so, but it was a calculated decision to only put in the section that says he seems to get paranoid and loses his temper, correct?
It was not calculated.
If it's not calculated, then why don't you add the actual diagnosis that's right below it on the actual sheet of paper?
I just took a snippet and put it on there.
Now, you had some, sorry, 1 second, please.
That's okay. There are a mass of wires down here, and I have big feet, and I keep pulling the wires apart. So I apologize for the interruption, but I was trying to repair what damage I had just inflicted.
I heard a noise and saw no judge, and it made me stop.
You go right ahead. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Thank you. There's some educational records they have in here, some that are from Roane County Schools, from the defendant's 9th grade year, where he admittedly did rather poorly in school, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then with Cott County, there were actually no grades given.
Right.
And then we move ahead to Ray County.
Mm-hmm.
Who was the defendant living with when he lived in Ray County?
Julie and Jimmy Creaseman.
And while he was living with them, it appears as though his grades went up considerably to his credit, correct?
Right.
Have you reviewed documents around the time, DCS documents around the time where he was living with the Creasemans?
Yes, I have.
And you were aware that he was under the thumb, so to speak, of a juvenile court judge to do well in school?
Yes, that is correct.
And so he was able to perform in that instance, correct?
I mean, part of the time he was under the thumb of the court. Certainly not the whole time, but yes, he was doing better with his grades.
For instance, let's see, in Math 2 Foundations, looks like a 73. English is 70, World Geography 74, Math is 83. So fair grades.
I mean, they're certainly not great, but they're better from where he was. I mean, he's passing at least.
Sure. But he's able to achieve that, correct?
Sure.
How long did the defendant live with Julie and James or Jimmy Creaseman?
I think it was from November of, I want to say 2002 maybe, until 2004. So maybe a year, about a year or so. Because I believe he turned 18 after being there for about a year.
And so you also have a slide in this, I guess it's slide 79, that says removed from the home, and I assume by that you mean the Creaseman home, correct?
Correct.
And placed in state custody, correct?
Very briefly, yes.
And what is the reason that the defendant was placed in state custody?
I think because he wasn't following the rules. And I think that from what I recall, there was an incident with Julie that where he was charged
Charged with
assault.
upon Miss Creaseman?
Correct.
And in that document that you're referring to, was Miss Creaseman pregnant at the time?
I believe she was.
Now, are you aware that the defense team sent us a PDF copy of your slides?
Yes.
And that's what I'm going off of?
Right.
You heard Dr. Karen speak before you, testify before you, correct?
I did.
And you heard her say that in 2007, the defendant was having up to 7 seizures a month, correct?
Yes.
And in that,
I don't remember the exact number, but about that.
certainly more than one, correct?
Yes.
And there was actually a slide in your previous copy that you sent, that was sent to the state, that you did not present here based on the doctor's testimony, correct?
Correct.
Because it was incorrect.
Correct.
Thank you. Under the slide of Stephen's a hard worker, you made a comment about the defendant beginning sheet metal work. You discussed that. You discussed Lexolite, correct?
Mm-hmm.
You just discussed Schaefer plumbing, correct?
Mm-hmm.
How long was the defendant's employment with Schaefer Plumbing?
I think he started in 2012, and I believe our Social Security information we got was up until around 2017, maybe.
If you don't mind, can you speak close to
Oh, I'm
the mic so
sorry.
we can hear you?
I think I believe it was from around 2012 until approximately 2017.
Okay. And was that a continuous employment?
I think it was part of the time, but I think it was also dependent upon the amount of work that needed to be done.
And so I guess
Pete Schaefer would be able to explain that a little bit better, but I mean, it's not like you probably have a full-time job where you go 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. I don't think it was like that all the time.
the story you got, speaking of Pete Schaefer, about the defendant taking him to the hospital, you got that directly from Mr. Schaefer?
Yes, I did.
You made a comment in your direct examination about any earnings that were reported, and made a comment about essentially, cash jobs, correct?
Correct.
Did you list any of those jobs that he held within this hard workers slide?
I believe I did.
And which of those jobs specifically did Mr. Wiggins not have reportable income?
Scrap metal, scrapping.
Okay. Now, you're an educated gentleman, correct? And as such, you tend to make a little bit higher wage, correct? As opposed to someone who is scrapping.
Correct.
And so, it appears that he earned, his highest earning was in 2015 with a just over $27,000 a year, correct?
Correct.
Were you aware that at some point, Mr. Wiggins alleges to have had $136,000 saved away and squirreled away somewhere?
I remember hearing something about that.
But that's not reported here.
I wasn't reporting savings, I was reporting earnings.
But the earnings you gave, you'd agree, total nowhere near $136,000.
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay. You told a couple stories about, in particular, a female that was, as you said, covered in blood.
Correct.
Who was that?
Danielle Vasquez.
Thank you. And based on your investigation, Ms. Vasquez and the defendant were close, correct?
Not at the time.
Not at the time?
They had just met the day before.
Okay, so strangers, essentially.
Correct.
All right. And she had some sort of medical incident?
Correct.
And he took her to seek medical care, correct?
That is correct.
And you've seen all the evidence from the crime, correct?
No.
You've seen the body cam, though, correct?
I saw the body cam, yes. I have not seen all the evidence of the crime.
Would you agree that Sergeant Baker was in need of medical care?
Objection. Relevance.
Objection is as to relevance, as to his opinion as to whether or not Sergeant Baker would need. Again, I would sustain the objection because his opinion is not relevant. Again, ladies and gentlemen, you are the ones who are the triers of fact, and it's your opinion that counts.
Did the defendant seek medical care for Sergeant Baker?
I don't believe so.
Mr. Cottle, you put some, I guess, messages between the defendant and his son Spencer in your PowerPoint.
Yes. Through Juanita, and there were messages, I believe, from Juanita.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
Sorry, it took me a minute to understand what you were
That's
saying.
okay.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
So, are you aware of phone calls that Mr. Wiggins may have placed to his mother and spoke to his son?
Are you asking me if I'm aware that they've spoken on the phone?
Yes.
Yes, I know they talked on the phone some.
Are you aware that there are recordings of some calls?
I know that jails record calls.
Have you reviewed those calls?
No, I have not.
1 second, please, Your Honor. Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Redirect. Do we have our food here?
Mr. Caudill, I want to go back to where we started with this thing. Your role in this case, was it to investigate the crime that occurred?
No, it was not.
And just to be clear, what was it?
My role was to look at the growth and development of the defendant and try to interview witnesses who could help give some context to what he experienced as a child and obtain records and then put together a kind of just a social history of what his life was like growing up.
And there was a little bit of, I think, back and forth confusion with you and Mr. White in the beginning when he was asking you if you investigated the facts.
Right.
Now, is that in the world of investigation, especially in criminal cases like this, is that a term that refers to investigating the facts of the offense itself?
Yes.
Right. And so when you're saying you're not investigating the facts, is that what you were referring to?
I don't think I said I was investigating facts. I think when you asked what my job title was, I said that I am a mitigation investigator, and then in other times I'm a fact investigator. But those are separate types of cases. Sometimes I am hired by the defense to go out and investigate a case, looking for facts, a robbery or
Surrounding the crime itself, correct?
Correct. But in this case, that's not what I was brought in for. This case was not as a fact investigator. It was only to look at the client's background and history as a child and his development.
And you were asked some questions about the information that you were able to investigate and find and report regarding the abuse that Stephen and Scotty and Juanita endured from Scott Wiggins. You recall?
Yes.
And I believe the state clarified or quantified it and tried to say, you just know that by I think they said, quote, stories that you were told of abuse, end quote. And you remember that?
Yes.
Now, by stories of abuse, you mean, didn't you in fact talk to Juanita, Scotty, Stephen, others?
Yes.
Or excuse me, Juanita, Scotty, and others?
Yes.
About firsthand abuse, their firsthand accounts of that abuse?
That is correct.
So they weren't just kind of ghost stories by the campfire, were they?
That is correct.
Those are my questions.
Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, sir. You may step down and you are released from further testimony. I believe we have our evening meal ready for you. And ladies and gentlemen, I just want to remind you again, once more, that it's important that you not try to discuss this case or anything else. And I'd also remind you, as I've told you from the very beginning, that sometimes I have to sustain objections. If I sustain an objection anytime to a question, you should disregard the question and not consider that question in any form. So I am, with that last instruction, I will release you to go about eating your supper, and then we're going to reconvene to continue as best we can for a little longer this evening. Thank you. Let's try to see if we can't be ready to reconvene at 6:45. It'll be about 35 minutes. If we can do that, that would help us to try to get as much accomplished tonight as possible. All right. We have recess then until 6.
All right.